Welcome, dear learners, to week 2, lesson 9. We were discussing psychoanalytical theory last time in the previous lesson, and we are continuing with that in this lesson too. We were discussing Jung and we were discussing Freud, eco-anxiety and climate change. Eco-anxiety is a psychological response to climate change characterized by feelings of helplessness, guilt, and fear about environmental degradation. So we already know that eco-anxiety is very prevalent today because young people are unable to react properly and unable to process these fears. They are bombarded from all sides, from media and from all websites and newspapers about climate change events, and that creates a lot of anxiety. That is called eco-anxiety, which it makes them insecure, it makes them helpless. On the top of that, humanity is said that it is responsible for what is happening, so they feel guilty also, and they feel helpless about how to change the situation, because it cannot be changed overnight by one person. It is something that needs community work, as we have already discussed. Psychoanalytical interpretation: eco-anxiety can be seen as the surfacing of repressed fears about mortality, the fragility of life, and the uncontrollability of nature. So it's this kind of anxiety in which one is told that any time a person can be dead, any time the world might come to an end. And with the political state of the world today, the wars that are going on, and the chemicals and the pollution that is being put into the environment, that is something that does create all these fears, and it does have some base to it. And literature deals with these things. Literature deals with eco-anxiety, especially those novels that are dystopian in nature, which talk about altered futures. Literary examples of such texts are The Road by Cormac McCarthy, and the characters in this novel, they experience existential dread and anxiety in a post-apocalyptic world. While on one hand there's fear and insecurity, on the other hand there's a denial of climate change, and the denial is the outcome of not being able to deal with things, not being able to process one's feelings, or the denial may be on the part of larger companies and establishments which do not want to lose their money, don't want to lose their investments. So there are so many companies out there that depend on fossil fuels, and would depend on cutting down forest, depend on gallons and gallons of water. So climate change denial is also an important element in climate literature, and so are defense mechanisms. Definition of denial: a defense mechanism where individuals or societies refuse to accept reality or facts, especially when they are threatening or cause distress. Denial in climate change: many individuals and governments are in denial about the severity of climate change, avoiding responsibility and delaying action. So one of the most current examples is the pharmaceutical industries and the chemical industries and the hotel industries, where large forests have to be cleared for resorts, etc. So all these, for example, would not believe in the climate threat, because believing in it and supporting the preservation of forest would lead to a loss of their investments. What other defense mechanism, what starts working when one is in great fear, one is threatened by danger? So, repression is one of them. It is like not letting the anxiety or the fear come out. It is refusing to think about the realities of climate change, thus burying the anxiety and guilt in causes in the unconscious. So, Freud talked a lot about repression of past memories and guilt. So, when his patients came to him with certain psychiatric illnesses, many of them were cases of repressed memories, which the patient had refused to deal with. Displacement, redirecting concerns about climate change into smaller, manageable issues, such as personal recycling habits, while ignoring the larger systemic problems. So, displacement is also a defense mechanism in which the larger issue is sidelined and one tries to build up some hope or tries to work out that anxiety in a small way, trying to manage some issues, recycling some things, and so ignoring the larger whole. Another one is projection. Projection means blaming others, other countries, industries, or future generations for the consequences of climate change, or perhaps blaming it on the past generation or the past political systems and governments for climate change, and thus avoiding personal responsibility and the present moment, where it is the moment where one has to act. So, avoiding that and avoiding acting, so that is projection. So, literature deals with the role of guilt and shame in climate change narratives. Guilt may be tied to individual behaviors, industrial practices, or government inaction. Shame, psychoanalytical criticism can explore how characters express shame over their inability to prevent environmental destruction. So, shame and guilt go hand in hand most of the time, and it's the anxiety and the fear about not being able to prevent environmental destruction that causes shame. And it is kind of unrealistic because one person alone can't make a change, and it can't be done overnight, and even a change in a certain country would be different kind of action that would be needed in another country. So shame is quite unrealistic. So all these things are considered in climate literature. Examples of literary depictions of guilt are Barbara Kingsolver's Flight Behavior, and the protagonist of this novel, Delorobia, reveals repressed feelings of collective responsibility. She suffers from guilt on various levels, and it is all connected. It starts from the outer environment, the predicament of the butterflies, and then it comes to a home, then it comes to her marriage. So she suffers guilt on several levels. Freud's death drive and climate change. What is death drive? Climate change as self-destruction. So psychoanalytical critics might interpret the human tendency to exploit and destroy the environment as an unconscious manifestation of the death drive. This drive towards ecological collapse can be viewed as a collective form of self-sabotage, where humanity's actions lead to the extinction of both the environment and themselves. So this very interesting novel, which I happened to mention earlier, titled Rapture. It is an climate fiction novel, and it deals with this drive to destroy oneself, and it is sort of shown as fated that the people will die, that the world will come to an end. It is a sign of salvation. And so religion is on one side, which makes it fate, and on the other side are the pharmaceutical companies that are trying to drill certain chemicals from the ocean. And if they manage to drill those chemicals, and if they are released into the atmosphere, then the earth will burn up. So while the earth is burning up, this group that is involved in rapture, in the return, biblical return to God, they believe the call from God has come. So we can see a Freudian death wish over here, and that symbolism is there in this novel. Other literary examples of this kind of dystopian future is in the in novel Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood. Humanity's self-destructive tendencies are dramatized through the collapse of ecosystems and civilizations. So there is a lot of progress in this novel, technological progress, technological innovations, genetic remodeling. So many elements of science fiction are there, but it's all aimed towards destruction, so that eventually the planet is destroyed. The Oedipus complex and human nature relations. Freud's Oedipus complex. The Oedipus complex can be extended to the human relationship with Mother Nature. Human control over nature. Humanity may have an Oedipal relationship with nature, seeking to dominate and control it, symbolized by the father figure to assert power and independence. Resolution. Humanity learns to coexist with environment rather than dominate it. So there are some writers of climate fiction who see Freud's Oedipal complex in the relationship between human beings and nature. Climate trauma and post-traumatic stress. So trauma is something that involves suffering, and climate change is no exception to that. So that may consist of PTSD, flashbacks, anxiety, and dissociation in response to environmental catastrophe. Literature can depict these psychological effects, offering insights into how climate disasters impact mental health. So interestingly enough, in the novel Rapture, there is an important character who is insane, and she has visions of climate. She can predict the weather. She can predict coming hurricanes and storms, though she is considered insane, and she is supposed to be the very dangerous kind of mental patient, because she has murdered her mother in a gruesome manner. So she represents this kind of disturbance in human form. Her connection with nature is there, but the relationships in her family, her relationships are disturbed. Her relationship with her parents is disturbed, and thus she represents that unique character who has some kind of trauma in her, and the trauma is psychological. So this story or this novel is a very good study of psychological trauma. The girl's name is Brittany, and there are a lot of things about her that can be considered objectionable. She uses very foul language. She has a total disconnect with other human beings. And since she has committed murder in a fit of rage or a fit of madness, she is always to be feared. So, studying her, we see that psychoanalysis comes in hand in studying climate change, because she is a unique combination of climate and human. The things come together in her, and she has this uncanny ability of predicting climate change. She even predicts the end of the world, the end, which is considered to be rapture by her priest father. Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. It has a dystopian setting. It talks about survival anxiety. The protagonist, Lauren Olamina's hyper-empathy stems from the trauma of living in a violent, unpredictable environment. So this goes back to the earlier novel, The Rapture. In that also, there is an unpredictable environment which creates trauma and creates the person that Brittany turns out to be. Community trauma, the breakdown of community structures due to environmental degradation. So, the community, its unity, its oneness is harmed by climate issues. So, if you just picture a scene of a flooded area, especially in some country, that developing country in Asia, and there is a shortage of food and water, and the people who once had a sense of community lose that sense of community because there is a scramble for water and food. There is a struggle to survive. So these are dire consequences of community trauma, which are caused by climate change and which are expressed in books like this one by Octavia Butler. There is a fluid identity, and afterwards there is a creation of new communities based on mutual interests or mutual goals of survival. There is the vision of a sustainable future in this novel. Earthseed reflects psychological resilience and the human capacity to adapt and find hope amidst despair. There is a connection to nature. There is a symbolism of the land. There is inheritance of fear, traumas passed down from her parents and community pass on to the future generation. There is a mention of coping mechanisms. So we can see that climate change, as seen in literature, has many facets in it, which can be psychological and can be stemming from dread to perhaps hope. Sublimation and climate activism. Sublimation too is a defense mechanism where socially unacceptable impulses or desires are transformed into socially productive activities. And if I remember right, there was a novel by R.K. Narayan, The Guide. And in this novel, the guide is an ordinary man. He is not elevated or evolved in any manner. And there's a time in his life when he becomes a kind of fugitive. He has been outcast from society, and he has just come out of prison. And then he comes in contact with these villagers who are praying for rain. And from somebody who has such a negative reputation, somebody who has suffered so much, in society, he suddenly turns into a saint because they are praying for rain, and he becomes the hermit or the saintly man who will deliver them and bring rain. So this kind of sublimation, it is also one of the elements in climate fiction. So before he dies like a saint, and because of his fasting and his prayers, the villagers get rain. So climate activism has been presented as sublimation. Some of the examples are also there, such as Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future. Psychoanalysis of apocalyptic and dystopian narratives. Fear of the end, the fear of death is there. Apocalyptic literature often taps into unconscious fears of death, extinction, and annihilation, reflecting humanity's anxiety about the future in the face of climate change. So, this is not very different from the existential crisis in which life becomes meaningless and absurd. So, here psychoanalysis reveals that there is a fear of death and extinction. Apocalyptic wish fulfillment. The apocalyptic narratives fulfill a subconscious desire for a clean state where the current social order is destroyed and a new, potentially better one can emerge. When we look at the novel Oryx and Crake, we see that the novel itself begins with a destroyed world, and it shows the hope that this destroyed world might bring another future, might bring a cleaner future. So other examples are Cormac McCarthy's The Road. The role of dreams and symbols in climate change literature. So as we have already mentioned, Freudian dream analysis is there. There are climate change dreams, nightmares of floods, storms, and ecological collapse can be seen as manifestations of repressed anxieties about the future. And it can be also done in the manner it was done in the novel that I mentioned earlier, The Rapture. In that, collective anxiety, collective fears are expressed through Brittany's state when she predicts storms and floods and the end of the world. Perhaps it is an expression of the repressed anxieties of collective humanity. There are symbolic interpretations too. Common environmental symbols can be interpreted psychoanalytically as representations of unconscious guilt, loss, and fear of death. Psychoanalysis of technology and climate change. Techno-fetishism. Freud's theories can be applied to analyze humanity's obsession with technology as a way to control nature. And there is an attempt to control nature, and there is a huge disconnect with nature, a huge alienation from nature. And this we are seeing when we hear every day about bees dying because of our overuse of our mobiles and the networks and the network towers. We hear about species of birds disappearing. So these show our disconnect with nature because the power that is emitted by these towers, these mobile towers, that they are very, very harmful for the atmosphere, very toxic, and thus we hear that bees lose their way, and there are many species of birds that have disappeared from the environments around us. If one were to look back at least just 10-15 years ago, one would remember that there were a lot of sparrows in many Indian neighborhoods around India, in UP. Now the sparrows are not to be seen. There are very few seen. So what is the reason? Is it because of the chemicals and pesticides, or is it because of these towers? Anyway, it reveals a disconnect with nature and a lack of interest and an indifference to nature, and one's interest in technology and a kind of techno fetishism. Now, let's go on to another important topic that literature discusses in connection with climate change, and this is yet another theory after psychoanalytical theory, and this is feminist criticism. Let us see how feminist criticism can be applied to climate change. Ecofeminism, intersection of feminism and environmentalism. So, if we look at this picture, we can see that the oppression that nature faces and the oppression that women face, they are somewhat similar. The exploitation, mistreatment, disrespect, and an attitude of indifference, the attitude of getting maximum benefit without any returns. So men, women and nature suffer the same thing from human beings. And if we talk about men in this context, then we may equate the lowest classes in society. We may talk about the Dalit literature, which again shows the closeness of the Dalit community to nature and to forest. And the suffering is quite similar. Being abused, being used, being oppressed, it's the same thing. So there's a domination of nature by patriarchy, and there's an interconnection of oppressions. Climate change as a gendered issue. Disproportionate impact on women. Women in developing nations, rural and low-income regions are more vulnerable to climate change because they often depend on natural resources for their livelihoods, etc., agriculture, water collection. So we have mentioned earlier on that the suffering of women in the climate impact is indeed very great. In places where there is scarcity of water, women are expected to fetch water. They are expected to take care of the fields also. They are expected to go to forest and cut wood. So in these communities where there is a dependence on natural resources for livelihood and survival, women are the worst sufferers. And there have been many organizations and many NGOs that have been working towards this, trying to bring these women out and forming them into communities and sort of trying to make their livelihood in such a way that they may survive better. For example, in Gujarat, the milk production by Anand and what we call Amul, that is actually how the resources of women, the work of women was pooled together and they formed communities. And these days in developing nations, there are many such NGOs and organizations that work with women and sort of use their skills to help them survive. So it may be skills related to embroidery, or it may be skills related to manufacture of foods like pickle and jams or other handicrafts. So such organizations have tried to lessen the impact of climate change on women. The women, they suffer from great social and economic inequality, and they have risk to their lives when these floods or these droughts occur. And we already know in India that in the rural setting, women suffer so many setbacks. They do not have a voice in their households. There are expectations that they have to take care of a household, they have to bear children, they have to suppress themselves before patriarchy. So, a simple thing like a toilet may not be there for a woman, and all these things are risks to their lives if when they have to go out in the fields in the darkness for water or for evacuation. So, climate change, especially in concern with water, is a great risk, and it reveals the social and economic inequalities that women suffer. Women are the ones who are the ones who take care of children, who take care of family. So it's when in cases of droughts and floods, it's not the case of survival of one man. It becomes the survival of a woman and her children, and there are mass deaths and there are contagious diseases. So there is so much suffering for women when such events take place. Feminist analysis of vulnerability. So, social vulnerability of women in the context of climate change. So, women are very vulnerable, especially in the Indian context. They do not step out of their houses in the lowest classes. It's very difficult for them to open out and to take medicine for their health, to attend to their health, and to attend to clinics, to go to clinics to take care of childbirth, for the care of mother and child. So there are so many areas where they become vulnerable, and climate change makes things worse. So let us stop here. I hope you got a good idea about how psychoanalysis works in the context of climate fiction. We will meet in lesson 10.